And now, a man who needs no introduction. It's Pac-Man on Game Boy Works episode 109. We've had an almighty heckload of games reminiscent of Pac-Man here on Game Boy Works, and now, at long last, Namco brings us the real deal. And it's Pac-Man, but it's honestly not the greatest version of Pac-Man you'll ever play. There's a reason people flipped out about how great the Neo Geo Pocket Color version of Pac-Man was, and it's because this was the competition. Pac-Man had a bit of a checkered history on Nintendo platforms in the 80s, thanks to Namco's falling out with Nintendo. The game briefly appeared in the US as an officially licensed title from TENGEN, an offshoot of Atari that ended up bringing a ton of Namco games to NES, thanks to the long-standing relationship between Atari and Namco. But TENGEN went rogue almost immediately, publishing games on Nintendo without a license. And Pac-Man soon became one of those unauthorized games and one of those weird black carts. There was no love lost, since Namco's president chafed at the restrictions Nintendo attempted to impose on all publishers once the NES's Japanese counterpart, the Family Computer, hit it big. Namco's leadership felt, and not without some justification, that the Famicom owed a great deal of its success to Namco's early support. So when Nintendo decided to treat them like any other third-party chattel, Namco said, nope. As such, we didn't see the company publishing NES games in the US under license until the end of 1993, right at the very end of the NES console's life. So it's interesting to see Namco on Game Boy in all regions here with Pac-Man this early. Pac-Man for Game Boy debuted in Japan in November 1990, and 6 months later in the US, all under the Namco name. I guess those hurt feelings only went so far. Namco didn't publish just a huge number of games for Game Boy compared to their support for other systems, and I kind of wonder about what Pac-Man doesn't offer a clue to the reasons for their relative scarcity. This is a troubled port of the game. It's not awful or anything, but you really get the impression that Namco, or whatever unknown studio they ghosted this project out to, found themselves at odds with the system's limited hardware. Pac-Man on Game Boy appears to use maze graphics converted directly from the NES version. Indeed, the maze lines up pixel for pixel between the NES and Game Boy. And you know what that means. That's right, Pac-Man has a problem with proportions. Yes, that plague of console to Game Boy direct conversions affects even this most legendary of works, and man, it sucks. The decision to retain the pixel dimensions of the maze, rather than resizing it to fit the handheld screen, means that you can only see a third of the maze at any given time. The screen has to scroll on both axes in order to keep up with the action. This is a huge strike against any conversion of Pac-Man. What makes it especially annoying is that the Game Boy screen is just wide enough to contain the Pac-Man maze horizontally if you squeeze it by 4 pixels. But no, rather than take that approach, Namco included a big blank sidebar that takes up more than a quarter of the screen's width to display the score and a lives counter. It's a strange design choice, and I have to wonder if it was done for performance reasons. See, Namco released Pac-Man on Sega's Game Gear just a few months later, and the Game Gear version takes the sidebar-free approach. As such, it only scrolls vertically, which makes the action a lot easier to keep up with. The score and the lives counter hover on top of the screen as an overlay, which is a little ugly, but it works better for the actual gameplay. So I suppose the question is, does Pac-Man's Game Boy sidebar exist because it's meant to mirror the NES version, which was a huge hit in Japan, or is it there because the Game Boy just couldn't handle displaying that much action at once? This version of Pac-Man is noticeably more sluggish than other latter-day ports. It moves at a fraction of the speed of the NES and Game Gear conversions, which leads you to suspect the game simply couldn't have spanned the entire screen. It's a chicken and egg affair, I guess. Is the viewpoint compromised because the action is so slow, or is the action so slow to compensate for the cropped viewpoint? And why does this even matter, you may wonder, because apparently you've never played Pac-Man before. Pac-Man was designed around fast action spanning a single screen. You should be able to look at a glance and take in the location of Pac-Man relative to the monsters chasing him, as well as being able to scan for which pellets need to be captured in order to complete the stage. But with only a third of the screen visible at a time, Pac-Man the game becomes far more difficult. You can't see at a glance where all of your enemies are most of the time, so there's a lot of guesswork involved. Even if you keep track of where the ghosts go off the screen, it's impossible to know exactly how they'll behave while they're out of sight. Unless you have the game's patterns memorized, I guess. It's also impossible to know at a glance how each ghost is going to behave when it does make its way back onto the screen. I suppose it goes without saying, but this version doesn't distinguish between the 4 different maze monsters in terms of their colors. All 4 monsters are the same shade of gray, which is to be expected, I suppose, but it's still unfortunate. This matters because each of the ghosts has its own distinct behavior. Those behaviors still come through here, but it's impossible to know which ghost is which when one pops onto the corner of the screen. Is it Red Blinky, who would doggedly pursue Pac-Man? Or is it Orange Clyde, who is more or less oblivious to Pac-Man and mostly does his own thing? The game's lack of a visual signal regarding the monsters' personalities turns the Game Boy port into something of a guessing game. It loses something essential between the lack of color and the removal of full-screen visuals, and it's a poor game for the loss. Pac-Man for Game Boy definitely feels like it's trying to balance out its shortcomings by tilting things slightly in the player's favor in other respects. Not only does everything move more slowly here than in other versions, the game feels noticeably more forgiving in terms of collisions. It's actually possible to pass through ghosts in certain situations. Of course, Pac-Man's collision detection was always pretty generous, and everyone who's ever played the game has had one of those sweaty-handed moments where a ghost was literally on top of Pac-Man, only to pull away at the last second, or grab an Energizer just in time. But here, a maze monster basically has to overlap Pac-Man before it registers a kill. Of course, this works both ways. You'll often fail to eat a frightened ghost or pick up a maze pellet that should have registered here due to the rather loose collision detection. The final pebble on this game's mountain of frustrations are its spongy controls. Pac-Man doesn't move as crisply as you'd like him to when ducking around the corners of the maze, which is strange because you'd think that this conversion's slower pace would create a greater allowance for tight controls. Unfortunately, no, and unlike other contemporary conversions of the game, I find this take on Pac-Man doesn't snap to respond the way he should. I constantly miss turns and wander into ghosts that my finger and brain attempt to evade. The spirit is willing, but the D-pad is weak. It's a so-so showing for a legendary video game, which is a shame. I'd go so far as to say that Pac-Man is the second most beloved legacy work ever to appear on Game Boy, right after Tetris. Again, I probably don't need to go into enormous detail on Pac-Man's history, but the game was the big international breakout title for publisher Namco. Conceived by Toru Iwatani, a designer at the company, Pac-Man was created to appeal to a broader audience than normally flocked to the shooting and pinball games Namco traded in, which is to say, it was meant to appeal to women as well as men. The colorful visuals and food-based theme, along with the lack of overt violence and the presence of abstract characters full of personality, made Pac-Man stand apart from its competitors. It was gaming's first mega hit, eclipsing Space Invaders' smash showing in Japan by dominating arcades all around the world. Pac-Man's simple gameplay involved a four-way joystick and nothing more, with a simple and intuitive goal: eat everything in the maze while avoiding the monsters. 4 special Energizer dots in the corner of the maze allowed Pac-Man to flip the tables on his aggressors and devour them in a brief window during which they changed color and became vulnerable. Pac-Man inspired merchandise, cartoons, and pop radio hits. It inspired sequels and rip-offs and sequels that began as rip-offs. It was massive, and it's appeared on nearly every game system in history, including Game Boy, of course. But if Tetris made use of Game Boy's design and limitations to its own advantage, Pac-Man succumbed to its shortcomings. It's slow, difficult to parse, and difficult to play. I know Pac-Man as a game concept is hard to improve on, but I do wish Namco had taken a page from Data East's book with their treatment of Lock and Chase. In arcades, Lock and Chase was a mediocre Pac-Man clone. On Game Boy, though, the game enjoyed a great revamp that makes it far and away a superior portable experience. At the very least, it would have been nice if Namco had included an option to scrunch up the graphics and play an uglier version of Pac-Man with tiny graphics in a full-screen maze. This port just doesn't cut it. Again, the superior Game Gear version came out just a few months later. I don't know how much of a direct one-to-one comparison most kids made, of course. I'm sure if you owned a Game Boy, you owned a Game Boy, and this was the version of Pac-Man you bought. Still, having those two versions of the same classic game land so close to one another play perfectly into the look at how bad and dumb Nintendo experiences are compared to ours marketing line Sega had begun pursuing around this time. And yeah, this really is a bad and dumb version of a classic video game. I'd like to say Namco would redeem themselves on Game Boy, but they didn't publish a whole lot of Game Boy titles that made their way to the US. Aside from a few weird excursions like Great Greed, Namco mostly treated Game Boy as a place to drop a few quick and easy ports of guaranteed system sellers. If your mom loved Tetris, she was probably going to buy Pac-Man too. This version didn't need to be great to sell. A universal hit like Pac-Man on a platform with broad appeal like Game Boy was guaranteed to sell well. Still, it would have been nice if they tried. Next on Game Boy Works, we go from low effort to maybe too much effort with the system's first 4-player experience.